Hello everyone, this is Dr. Hatami and welcome to another video on the Central Nervous System, Chapter 13. In this video, I'll be talking about the structure and function of the spinal cord. Let's get started. The spinal cord, which is part of the central nervous system, plays a crucial role in connecting the body to the brain. Let's break down its main functions to sensory and motor innervation, conduction pathway, and a reflex center. The spinal cord can send the sensory and motor signals to the body below the head via the spinal nerves, which we have 31 pair of the spinal nerves. And also within the spinal cord, you can see there are the axons going up and down in the white matter of the spinal cord, which we call them as ascending tract and descending tract, which means the fibers going up and down, and so they allow the two-way signals transmission between the brain and the body. So they can send the information, sensory information up to the brain, and they're gonna send the signals, the motor signals down to the body. And also spinal cord act as a reflex center, as the gray matter of the spinal cord is essential for reflexes. It's going to receive the sensory information, processes, integrates them with motor responses, allowing us to react quickly to certain stimuli without needing to involve the brain right away. So it means that we can do some automatic and quick reaction to the stimuli without our neuron, the cerebral cortex, to be involved. So at that part, the spinal cord would be the reflex center. Now let's take a look at the anatomy of the spinal cord. So you can see the spinal cord runs through the vertebral canal, which is going to be made by our vertebrae. It starts from the foramen magnum and ends at the level of L1, L2. The first to second lumbar vertebrae. So it does mean that the spinal cord does not occupy the whole vertebral canal in adult. It ends at the level of L1 and 2, and as you can see, the spinal cord tapers at its inferior end and make a cone-shaped structure, which is called the conus medullaris. Then there is a fine filament, the filament of the connective tissue, which is gonna connect the conus medullaris to the coccyx bone. It anchors the spinal cord to the coccyx and prevents the any movement of the spinal cord, which this filament is called the phylum or phylum terminale. Then look at here at the spinal cord. You can see some enlargement. One going to be found in the cervical part and another going to be found in the lumbar part. So we have the cervical and lumbar enlargement. These two important expansions are wider because they give rise to nerves that serve our upper and lower limbs. And finally, there is a structure after the spinal cord ends. We can find some spinal nerves which they look like a horse tail. It's called coda equina. The coda equina is a bundle of lumbar and sacral spinal nerves that hangs down within the vertebral canal. So then, as you can see here, just let's review it. The spinal cords run through the vertebral canal from the foramen magnum of the occipital bone to the L1, L2, and then after L1, L2, which this ending part of the spinal cord is conus medullaris. Then we will have the coda equina inside of the vertebral canal, and the spinal cord gonna be connected to the coccyx through the filament, which is called the filum terminale. Okay, let's take a look at the spinal cord segments. So we can actually divide the spinal cord into 31 segments that are categorized into different regions. We have 8 cervical segments, 12 thoracic segment, 5 lumbar spinal cord segment, 5 sacral segment, and 1 coccygeal segment. It's important to note that the spinal cord is actually shorter than the vertebral column, which means that the spinal cord segments are positioned higher up than where the corresponding spinal nerves exist. For example, T12 segment of the spinal cord is located at the level of T1. So here, the T12 segment of the spinal cord going to be found here at the level of T1. And then L5 segment going to be found at the level of T11 vertebrae. So here we should have the L5 segment of the spinal cord. And we will see the S1 segment is positioned at the level of the L1. So here we can have the S1 segment of the spinal cord. So as you can see, for example, here we have the spinal cord segment C1, which is close to the adjacent to the corresponding vertebrae, like C1 vertebrae, C2 segment adjacent to the C2, but when we go down in the lower region, the spinal cord segments are not adjacent to their corresponding vertebrae. That's because the spinal cords grow more slowly than the vertebral column during the development. So then we will see here we have the L1 vertebrae, but the S1 segment is gonna be found here. And finally, the spinal cords ends here at the level of L1, L2. Now we're going to talk about the spinal cord anatomy through the cross section. This is a picture, means that you cut the spinal cord and you're looking at the cross section of the spinal cord. To fully understand the anatomy of a spinal cord, you should know that we should define white matter and gray matter for the spinal cord as we did for the brain. White matter means that in that area of the central nervous system, mostly we have the axons, myelinated axons, and also unmyelinated axons. And in the gray matter, we should have the neuron cell bodies, the dendrites, glial cells, and also some short unmyelinated axons. For the brain, if you remember, we define the gray matter outside and white matter inside, but for the spinal cord, we're going to define white matter outside and gray matter inside. And look at the gray matter. It looks like the letter H. Related to the white matter, you should know the in the white matter, we have the fibers go up and down. We have tract traveling up and down to the brain and from the brain through the white matter. And related to the gray matter, you should know the gray matter is composed of horns. We have dorsal horn located in the posterior part of the spinal cord, and we have ventral horn located in the anterior part of the spinal cord. In some areas of thoracic and superior lumbar, we can add the lateral horn as well. Lateral horn. Okay, and also related to each dorsal and ventral horn, there are dorsal root and ventral root, which they're gonna carry the sensory and motor fibers. So in dorsal root, we have the sensory fibers, and in ventral root, we have the motor fibers, which the motor fibers carry the motor information or the motor signals from the spinal cord to the muscle and glands or to the body. So if I want to show you the direction of the signals, I'm going to do this. That is the direction of the motor signals from the spinal cord to the body, which we have here the ventral root. And then in dorsal root, actually, we have the sensory signals traveling from the body toward the spinal cord. So these are the sensory fibers. So make sure you know the ventral root is related to the motor fibers or motor information, and dorsal root is related to the sensory information or sensory fibers. And then we can say the dorsal horn is also related to the sensory and ventral horn related to the motor. Okay, and now let's go over the white matter of the spinal cord a little bit in detail. So we learned that the white matter of the spinal cord is composed of the myelinated and unmyelinated axons, which these axons can make tract, which this tract can go up from body to the brain, and we call this tract as ascending tract. Do you know what kind of information we're gonna send from body to the brain? Sensory or motor? Good job. We're gonna send the sensory information through the ascending tract or ascending fibers from body to the brain. And also we have the tract which they're gonna send the signals from the brain to the body. And guess what kind of information or signals should be carried from brain to the body through the descending fibers or descending tract? Thank you. That should be motor, right? So then ascending fibers or ascending tract carry this sensory information from body to the brain, and descending fibers or descending tract, they're gonna carry the motor information from brain to the body, which means muscles and glands. And in between we have the commissural fibers, which they travel transversely from one side of the spinal cord to another side, and they're gonna transmit the information across sides of the spinal cord. Then we can divide the white matter to the three funiculi or three columns. Based on their location, we have dorsal or posterior funiculus, anterior or ventral funiculus, and lateral funiculus. Okay, let's go back to this picture, and one more time, let's look at the white matter. I'm going to erase the other part because right now we're going to focus on the white matter of the spinal cord. So as I mentioned before, the white matter of the spinal cord is going to be found outside. The gray matter would be found inside. So the white matter of the spinal cord found posterior of the spinal cord is called dorsal funiculus. And then at the side of the spinal cord in the white matter, we have the lateral funiculus. And then anterior of the spinal cord, we have the ventral funiculus. So dorsal funiculus or dorsal column, ventral funiculus or ventral column, and lateral funiculus or lateral column. These are part of the white matter, which in each part we can have ascending tract, descending tract going up and down to the brain or from the brain and carry the sensory or and motor information. Now let's focus on the gray matter of the spinal cord. What does it mean, gray matter? What kind of area is that? The gray matter of the spinal cord or gray matter of the brain is the area mostly we have the neuron cell bodies, short non-myelinated axons, dendrite, and neuroglia. So, and we saw that the shape of the gray matter of the spinal cord is like the letter H. So I'm gonna draw the gray matter like the letter H, and then the gray matter is actually composed of the horns, which the dorsal horn are slender and longer, and ventral horn are wider and wider and shorter. And also at the center of the spinal cord, I'm going to draw a canal, which this canal is called the central canal, which inside of the central canal, we have the cerebrospinal fluid. So if you remember the cerebrospinal fluid, after passing through the fourth ventricle, then it goes to the central canal of the spinal cord, which gonna be filled with CSF, the cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, so then let's label this part as we have the ventral horn, and then we have the dorsal horn, and in some area of this the spinal cord, which is the thoracic and superior segment, we also can add a lateral horn. Okay, so based on the definition of the gray matter, in the dorsal horn, lateral horn, and ventral horn, we should have the neuron cell body. If you remember, we divided the neuron based on their function to the sensory neuron, interneuron, and motor neuron. Sensory neuron was the neuron, it can carry the information from a body or receptor to the central nervous system. The motor neuron are the neuron which they're gonna carry the signal, the motor signal from CNS to the body, which is muscle and organ, that is motor. And then between these sensory and motor, we have interneuron. The question is that, what kind of neuron gonna be found in dorsal horn? What kind of neuron gonna be found in ventral horn? And what kind of neuron gonna be found in lateral horn? So I want you, after watching this video, write down in the comment section of the YouTube video that what kind of neuron gonna be found in dorsal horn. The answer is easy because right now I'm gonna cover this. Please make sure that you are paying attention to this part. Right now, I'm going to cover the type of neuron we can have in each of these part of the gray matter. Dorsal horn, the lateral horn, and also the ventral horn. So look at here. In dorsal horn, which is related to the dorsal root, look at the type of neuron that we have here, which actually this is a sensory neuron. This sensory neuron is the unipolar neuron that you can see. It has one single cytoplasmic processes, which they split into the peripheral and central processes. That is a sensory neuron. So if I want to label this neuron is the sensory neuron, which, as you can see, this sensory neuron going to be found outside of the spinal cord. So inside of a sac, which we have the collection of the cell body of neuron, this structure is called ganglion. So we have the dorsal root ganglion outside of the spinal cord, which these are the cell body of the sensory neuron, which means that they're going to carry the sensory information from our body, from the receptors toward the spinal cord. That is the direction of the signals. These are going to carry the sensory signals from the receptor, from body to the spinal cord. Then you will see that in the dorsal horn, there is no cell body of sensory neuron. Instead, we have the cell body of interneurons, which these interneurons is going to receive this sensory information, process them, and integrate them and make a response. Then in the ventral horn, you will see we have the motor neuron, which this motor neuron or the cell body of motor neuron, which they're gonna send the motor signals through the motor fibers toward the body or toward the muscles and glands. Look at the direction of the signals from the spinal cord to the body, which it means that our ventral root is going to carry the motor information and is related to the motor. And the cell body of these motor neurons is going to be found right here in the ventral horn. So in the ventral horn, we have the cell body of motor neurons. In the dorsal horn, we have the cell body of the interneurons. And then the cell body of sensory neurons is going to be found in the dorsal root ganglion outside of the spinal cord. And one more thing regarding the lateral horn, which the lateral horn, as I mentioned before, going to be found in thoracic and superior lumbar region, is composed of the neuron cell body of the autonomic motor neuron related to the sympathetic and parasympathetic fibers. Okay, so now let's review whatever we talked about the gray matter of the spinal cord. The gray matter of the spinal cord found inside of the spinal cord as the H-shape structure, which is composed of the dorsal or posterior horn, ventral or anterior horn, and lateral horn. Dorsal or posterior horn consists of the interneuron, which gonna receive the sensory information from dorsal root, from actually the sensory neuron, which this sensory neuron cell body gonna be found in the dorsal root ganglion, which they're gonna kind of receive the information from the receptors of our body. And then ventral or anterior horn, which they contain the motor neuron cell body. They're going to send the motor signals to the muscles and glands via the ventral root. And then last we have the lateral horns present in thoracic and superior lumbar segments, which contain the motor neuron cell body of autonomic nervous system. Okay, if you think this part was a little confusing or too much information, let's do that. Let's grab a piece of paper and then let's draw the spinal cord transfer section with me. The first thing that I'm going to draw is the gray matter of the spinal cord. I'm going to draw the posterior or dorsal horn, which I try to draw it as longer and slender, and then the ventral horn as wider and shorter. So we have the right and left ventral horn, and then right and left dorsal horn. And also, do not forget to draw the central canal, which we know at the central canal we should have the cerebrospinal fluid. So if I want to label this, I should draw this as ventral horn, which gonna be found on the anterior side of the spinal cord. And then here I'm going to label this as the dorsal horn on the posterior side of the spinal cord. And what else I should draw? Now I'm going to draw the outside white matter. Okay. The outside white matter, and then I'm going to draw the funiculus. So here we have the dorsal funiculus, which at the dorsal funiculus we should have the tract going up and down full of the axons. And then we have the lateral funiculus. Again, we have the axons going up and down. And one more, we have the ventral funiculus. So knowing the white matter of the spinal cord is pretty easy and straightforward. But let's look at this gray matter. So here, the gray matter, we divided it to the dorsal horn and to the ventral horn. Related to the dorsal horn, we have the dorsal root. So then let's draw the dorsal root. And related to the ventral horn, we have the ventral root. In dorsal root and ventral root, we have the fibers passing. The fibers passing through the dorsal root, they are going to carry the information from the body to the spinal cord. What kind of fibers they should be? What kind of information they should be? Sensory or motor? Good job. That should be the sensory fibers, right? So these are the sensory fibers. These are the sensory information passing through the dorsal root to the spinal cord. And then on the other side, the ventral root, you can see the direction of the signals from the spinal cord to the body, which they are motor fibers. Okay, what is the neuron carry the sensory information? This should be sensory neurons. The sensory neurons found here are the unipolar sensory neurons, which means that they have a neuron cell body and then one single cellular extension, which is split into the peripheral and central processes. Another unipolar and another cytoplasmic processes. So as you can see here, outside of the spinal cord, we will have a sac, which a bulge, which is full of the cell body of sensory neurons. So here we have the sensory neurons when their cell body gonna be found here, and then we call this structure as what? Dorsal root ganglion. Okay, and then as you can see, these neurons they collect the sensory information and then send this information to the dorsal root. So then we have the neuron cell body here, but what kind of neuron they are? Are they sensory? Are they interneuron? Or they are motor? You should answer this question in the comments of the comment part of this YouTube. Okay, that actually you got the answer in the previous slide, but just now I want you guys to know or to write down it in the comments below to make sure you fully understood regarding the neuron that we should have here. Just like guidance, these neurons is going to receive this sensory information and they're gonna process those information and they're gonna make a response. And then here at the ventral horn, we will have the motor neuron, which this motor neuron gonna send their axon through the ventral root, and then they're gonna send these motor signals to the muscles and glands. That is a summary of the anatomy of a spinal cord, which you should know regarding the horn, dorsal horn, ventral horn, dorsal root, ventral root, and also if we have the segment at the thoracic and the superior lumbar, we should talk about another horn, which is called the lateral horn. Okay, now let's look at the spinal cord protection. How spinal cord could be protected, because it's a very important structure. So we have the bone vertebrae which are going to surround the spinal cord and create a strong barrier to protect it from injury. And we also have the meninges, which these are the three layers surrounding the spinal cord. We have dura mater, which this is a tough outer layer. It's important to note that it isn't directly attached to the surrounding bone. Then we have the arachnoid mater, which is a middle layer, acts like a web to protect the spinal cord. And then the innermost layer is called pia mater, which it extends down to the coccyx and covers a structure called the filum terminale. Additionally, the denticulate ligaments are extensions of the pia mater that help secure the spinal cord to the dura mater and providing the further stability. So the structure related to the pia mater is the filum terminale and also the denticulate ligament. The filum terminale is going to connect the conus medullaris to the coccyx, and then denticulate ligament is the extension of the pia mater, which is going to connect the dura mater, dura mater to the spinal cord. And finally, don't forget about the cerebrospinal fluid. As we had the cerebrospinal fluid around and inside of the brain, now we're going to talk about how the cerebrospinal fluid is going to be found around and inside of the spinal cord, cushioning and protecting the spinal cord. The cerebrospinal fluid is going to be found inside of the spinal cord, inside of the central canal, do you remember? And also outside of the spinal cord within the subarachnoid space or under the middle layer of the meninges. So then it cushions the spinal cord and also provides the shock absorption. So let's take a look at this picture. So as you can see here, we can find the gray matter inside the central canal gonna be found at the center, filling with the CSF, and then we can see the dorsal funiculus, the ventral funiculus, the lateral funiculus, and also you can find the dorsal horn, the lateral horn, and ventral horn. That is the structure of the spinal cord. Then you can see the dorsal root, the ventral root, the dorsal root ganglion, and look at here how the dorsal root and ventral root just merged together and made the spinal nerve. Each of these is called the spinal nerve. And now let's focus on the meninges, which they can protect the brain. The outermost layer is the spinal dura mater, and then the middle layer is the arachnoid mater, and the innermost layer, which is impossible to separate it from the spinal cord, is the pia mater. And then exactly like the brain, under the arachnoid mater, there is a space which is called the subarachnoid space, which is going to be filled with the fluid. Speaking about the spaces between the layers, let's go over these as well. The epidural space, the subdural space, and subarachnoid space. Epi means above. So epidural space is the space, is a cavity gonna be found between the dural matter and vertebrae. We do not have this space in brain between dural matter and cranial bones. This space only gonna be found between the dural matter and vertebrae, only gonna be found in the spinal cord, around the spinal cord. It's gonna contain fat tissue and also blood vessel. So in the epidural space, we have fat tissue and blood vessel, which is important in clinic because the anesthetic injections can be administered here, and through that they can actually do the epidural injection for some surgery that they are going to do, or to kind of diminish the pain, they can use the epidural injection. Next, we have subdural space. It's a potential space between dural matter and arachnoid matter. It's normally not filled with fluid, but if there is a bleeding, the subdural space can be filled with blood. And then subarachnoid space is a space between the arachnoid matter and pia matter, or the space just under the arachnoid matter, which it contains the cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, so now let's review all of these spaces. The epidural space, look at here. This space is located between the dural mater and the vertebrae, only going to be found around the spinal cord, okay? So it's filled with cushioning fat and blood vessels, providing the extra protection for the spinal cord. This is also where anesthetic injections can be given, especially during the precision like childbirth, for reducing the pain or relieve the pain during labor and delivery, and also for managing the chronic pain. They all can do that as well, the epidural injection. Then subdural space, look at here, this is actually a potential space. It means that normally there is no space, but if there is like a blood, they can be collected here. Is a potential space found between the dural matter and the arachnoid matter. So as I mentioned, normally it does not contain any fluid, but it can fill with fluid in certain medical conditions. Subarachnoid space, which is this space under the arachnoid, which you can see here, between the arachnoid and pia mater, around the spinal cord, we have the cerebrospinal fluid here. Okay, now let's discuss how we safely collect the cerebrospinal fluid. or CSF through a procedure called a lumbar puncture. Lumbar puncture or spinal tap is a safe insertion of a needle below the spinal cord level. So the needle is inserted below the level of spinal cord, specifically between L3, L4 or L4, L5. This is crucial because the spinal cord ends around the L1, L2 level. So we want to avoid damaging the spinal cord. This procedure involves inserting a needle into the subarachnoid space where the CSF is located. So this allows us to collect the fluid safely without damaging the spinal cord. To make this easier, the patient typically bends forward, which opens up the spaces between the vertebrae and allowing for better accesses. So this procedure is essential for diagnosing conditions affecting the brain and the spinal cord and ensures patient safety by avoiding injury to the spinal cord. Now let's just talk about the spinal nerve just very quickly and make sure you know spinal nerves are not part of the central nervous system. They are not part of the central nervous system, but they're going to arise from the spinal cord segments. We have 31 spinal cord segments and we have 31 pairs of spinal nerve. There are 8 cervical spinal nerve from C1 to C8. We have 12 thoracic spinal nerve from T1 to T12, and there are 5 lumbar spinal nerve L1 to L5 and 5 sacral spinal nerve and 1 coccygeal spinal nerve. Each spinal nerve passes through an intervertebral foramen, which is a hole between the vertebrae. And then the way that they are going to be named is related to their adjacent vertebrae. The C1 to C7 spinal nerve, they pass above the same number of vertebrae, which means C1 pass above the C1, C2 cervical spinal nerve pass above the C2, C3 spinal nerve pass above the C3 and then to the C7. The C7 gonna pass above the C7, but from C8 below the C8 they're gonna pass below the same number. So T1 gonna pass below the T1, T2 pass below the T2 vertebrae, T3 spinal nerve pass below the T3 spinal nerve. So their naming is based on the like vertebrae gonna be found above them or below them. Thank you so much for listening to this video.